Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for trusting me to come and for speaking. It's a great honor to be here. And thank you to all of you for coming and taking time out of your days and your evenings to listen to what I have to say. I hope you find it insightful, maybe enjoyable. But I also like to start every talk I say by making a couple of concessions. The first concession I like to make is that the problem with listening to speakers or watching documentaries is that often we take everything they say on face value. And I actually think that's quite dangerous. And so I think it's really important that any information we're given, we scrutinize, and then we go home and we do some independent research on our own. So I hope today that the things I say maybe spark an element of curiosity within you that makes you want to go and look up these things on your own. I think that's a really important thing. And the second thing is, turn off your phone. No. The second thing would be, no, I'm only joking. The second thing would be, please hold on to any questions that you can think of. At the end, we're going to have some time for some audience questions as well. So hold on to anything you can think of, and we'll try and get through as much as we possibly can. Okay. We're going to talk about a range of different issues related to veganism, but I want to give you a little bit of context about who I am and give you a little bit of my backstory as well, because I wasn't born vegan. I think sometimes there's an idea that people who are really passionate about veganism probably were born vegan, because why would we ever want to give up eating animal products, especially when they taste so good, right? It's often a question that's proposed to me. Now, I ate meat for about 20 years and was consuming dairy and eggs for almost another year on top of that. And I was raised in a family where being a vegetarian was a joke. We used to laugh at the prospect of being vegetarian. We didn't know what a vegan was when I was young, but if we did, we'd have probably mocked vegans even more. But we thought vegetarian was as far as it went. I just remember being sat around my dinner table when I was probably about 9 or 10 years old. My stepdad, he would always make the same joke. And it's a really not funny joke at all. Like, it's not funny. But he always made the same joke. He would say, "Ed." And I'd go, "Yeah?" He'd say, "What's the best thing about having a vegetarian around for dinner?" And I'd start laughing to myself. I'd go, "Oh, what?" And he'd go, "Oh, that means we get more meat, right? More meat for us." I thought, haha, no, it's not funny, right? I told you it's not funny. But we used to laugh about it all the time. We thought it was brilliant. I remember being 12 years old, and I was sat in an English literature class, and we were studying a book. And in the book, there was a vegetarian character. And my teacher asks the class, she says, "What do you think about being vegetarian?" So I put my hand up in the air, and my teacher's like, "Yes, Edward." And I said, "All vegetarians are pale, weak, and skinny." Right? But it was ironic. I was like the weakest and skinniest in the room, and I ate meat every single day, right? I had no idea what irony was when I was 12. Now, there was someone sat behind me called Natasha. Now, Natasha was a vegetarian. And so I turned to look at Natasha, thinking she might validate what I'd said, give me the thumbs up. But I looked at her, and she was really angry. Oh, she was so cross, like she was furious. I remember being a little bit taken aback. And so I turned from Natasha to look at my teacher, thinking my teacher might validate my response. But my teacher looked really worried, like she was super concerned she was going to get into trouble. I said a lot of things when I was 12 years old that were obviously nonsensical, were illogical. But I remember that moment, I think, because it reinforces how as children, we're like sponges. And we absorb information that's given to us in the same way a sponge absorbs water. I mean, we're told things growing up, and we take them as being the truth because, well, our survival in many ways depends on us trusting those around us and the information they give us. It's almost like we're a blank canvas, like a white canvas. Our values, morals, beliefs, lifestyles, they're given to us by our families, by our cultures, by our societies, by our traditions, by our festivals. And so we become a certain age where we don't actually start to think too critically about the way that we live. Instead, we act unconsciously, and we just regurgitate information we've been told without ever trying to work out the authenticity of that information. So for me, being 12, it was, I need meat for protein. And there was no other way of seeing it, even though, of course, we can get protein from plants instead. Okay, now I'm 18 years old, and I'm ordering pizza with a friend. My friend is vegetarian, I am not. And I quite like my friend being vegetarian because he never said a word to me about it. We had this great little relationship where he knew that I wasn't and I knew that he was, and we just didn't talk to each other about it. But one day, he says to me, "Ed, why don't we order a pizza and we'll make it vegetarian? We'll just get one pizza and share it." And I looked at him and I said, "This is obviously a joke. This must be a joke." He said, "It's Ed. You know me. When have you ever seen me eating vegetarian food? He said, well, Ed, I don't understand. Why not? Just try it. And I said, well, I'll tell you why not. And it's very simple, because bacon goes on pizza, right? End of discussion. If there's no bacon on that pizza, that is some fake pizza, right? And I'm not spending my money on any fake pizza. You've got to be kidding me. And he said, Ed, why should an animal die for a pizza topping? A pizza topping. This is when I started getting angry. I said, what do you mean a pizza topping? I mean, we give pigs life, and they give us bacon. It's the food chain, right? How can you argue against that? He told me he didn't think it was a very good reason. I said I didn't care, and we ended up getting a half and half. He got his veggie, I got my bacon half. I'm stubborn. Well, I still am, yeah, of course. I was definitely stubborn back then. Now, everything started to change for me in May 2014. I was reading the BBC online, and I came across this story. Now, this story was about a truck carrying 6,000 chickens crashing on the way to a slaughterhouse near the city of Manchester in England. I remember reading this story and feeling quite horrified, because the journalist had said that 1,500 of the birds had died from the crash alone. They were just killed. But that's not actually what upset me the most. What upset me more was the fact there were hundreds more of these animals who had broken wings, broken bones, broken beaks, broken combs. They were trapped under the truck, and they were suffering and in pain. And I made this very simple realization. The animals I consume have the capacity to suffer and feel pain. It's obvious, of course, but I'd never thought about it. And this made me feel very uncomfortable, because in my fridge was fried chicken. And when I used to eat animals, fried chicken was my favorite. I had a KFC that was a 5-minute walk from where I used to live. And 5 minutes is dangerously close. Sorry, 5 minutes, so close. And so I went there so often, the workers knew my name, Ed, and they knew what my favorite order was, which was a Zinger box meal. I used to get it towered up so it came with a hash brown and an extra portion of hot wings as well. But I am feeling sorry for these chickens, yet in my fridge is the reason why they're being taken to be slaughtered. And so I looked into the farming, I looked into the slaughter, and I couldn't find a way to justify what was happening and justify me paying for it to happen. And so I went vegetarian at that point, because I strongly believe that knowledge is power. And what I mean by that is when we learn something about ourselves or about an industry, we become empowered to act on this new information. Because if we don't know both sides of the story, then how can we ever make informed decisions based on how we truly feel? In that moment, I'd learned that I wasn't happy with the situation of what was happening to these animals. And I learned that I was inflicting these problems by paying for them. And so I had a responsibility to act on that, and that was to change. But at that point, I only changed to vegetarian. And now I have to be really honest with you. I was a vegetarian who thought vegans were mental. I didn't understand vegans at all. I thought vegans were self-righteous. I thought they were arrogant. I thought they had no sense of humor. I thought these vegans, right, just crack a smile. You know, it's not going to kill you. Dairy cows produce milk, and egg-laying hens lay eggs. No one has to die for that, so just take a step back, you know, right? Anyway, I was forced to eat my words somewhat ironically. After 8 months of being vegetarian, I watched a documentary called Earthlings, which is on YouTube. The documentary talks about all the different ways that we use animals, so not just for meat, but for dairy and for eggs. Also entertainment, so things like aquariums, like SeaWorld. Also leather and fur. Afterwards, I was feeling pretty shell-shocked. I was kind of distraught, actually. The film's maybe 90 minutes long or an hour 40, and it's just horrific footage the entire time, like really brutal stuff. And so I was feeling quite upset. Now, at the time, I had a hamster called Rupert, right? I loved Rupert the hamster dearly, right? He's my favorite. Now, growing up, I was never really around animals. I never really had pets, and so Rupert was my first pet, and so I loved him a lot. Now, after the film, I thought, you know what I need? A bit of TLC, right? A little bit of fun time with Rupert the hamster, because whenever I gave Rupert broccoli, the way he ate it made me feel better. There's something about hamsters eating that is just so insatiably adorable, right? That you can't feel sad at all watching a hamster. And so I thought, I feel sad. I'm going to selfishly give Rupert some broccoli. He's going to eat it, and then everything's going to be miraculously fine again. So I get Rupert, and he's eating the broccoli on my hands, and I'm like, oh, Rupert, right? And I look at him, and I think to myself, gosh, Rupert is such a little individual. He's got so much about him, likes and dislikes. So liked broccoli, but he didn't like kale very much. He wasn't a fan of kale. I get that. I mean, kale's a bit iffy, isn't it? If you gave him kale, he would eat it, but he would look at you. He'd be like, really? Kale? Also, Rupert the hamster was the laziest hamster who had ever lived. Oh, he was so lazy. With hamsters, you get them the wheels, right? And they run on those wheels, right, for hours. Well, apparently. And also, you get them the ball. So you put a hamster in a ball and they like run around the room in the ball. Well, I bought Rupert the hamster a wheel. He tried it once and decided it wasn't for him. And so for 2.5 years, he never touched it again, right? And then I got him a ball thinking it would be great. He could run around the room. But every time I put him in the ball, he would just sit there and take the food from his cheeks and eat. And he wouldn't run anywhere. I was like, Rupert, like, come on, it's not going to kill you to do some cardiovascular work, is it? Just have a run. Yeah, well, he didn't. And I'm looking at him, and I'm thinking, wow, there's so much about Rupert that makes him special and unique. And I've identified so much in Rupert, and I have to be honest, because the Syrian hamster is not the most intelligent animal that walks this planet, right? They're amazing, but Rupert wasn't the most intelligent being. And I'm thinking, there's so much within Rupert that I have to also recognize by default they exist within the pigs, the cows, the chickens, the lambs, even those marine animals in the ocean that we often don't think about. And if I wouldn't want anyone to hurt Rupert, and it would make me sad and angry if someone hurt him, well, then what right do I have to pay for animals who are identical in every single way that matters to Rupert to be killed for me or to have suffering put on them for me? And that's what made me go vegan. That realization of looking at the animal in my life who I loved, joining the dots with everything I'd seen before, and connecting with the fact that my actions weren't in alignment with my morals. Now, I was a quiet vegan when I first became vegan. I did not want to be labeled as preachy and militant. As you can tell, I'm not too worried about the preachy label anymore, right? But at the time, I was quite worried about it. And so I went into university where I was studying and ate my lentils and my hummus and didn't say a word to anyone. And then one day, I saw a documentary called Cowspiracy, which talks about all the different ways that eating animal products is bad for our environment. Now, being at university, I had a lot of friends who were quite focused on climate change, used to talk a lot about the environmental crisis. And I thought, this is it. This is it. I'm going to go into university. I'm going to tell my friends to watch Cowspiracy. They're going to watch it. And we're going to be like one big vegan family, right? And we'll eat lentils and hummus together and talk about like animals and stuff. And it'll be so great. So I'm quite chipper. I'm walking into university the next morning. And I go up to my friends and I say, you guys, you have to watch this documentary called Cowspiracy. It's about meat and the environment. Go home and watch it. And this one girl, she looked at me. She was called Rihanna. And she said, Ed, you know what, Ed? I'm so delighted that you're vegan. I think it's fantastic you're vegan. I couldn't be happier for you. You know what I really like? That we live in a world where you have the choice to be vegan. Isn't that fantastic? But, she said, Ed, the thing is, it's kind of a bit ironic for you to talk about the environment and meat when you consume soy milk and tofu. And soya farming's destroying the Amazon rainforest. And if you consume those products, you're responsible for the deforestation of the Amazon. And I remember I took a step back. I thought, is this true? I'd not heard about this before. And I thought, well, I do consume soy products like tofu and soy milk. So needless to say, it must be true that I'm the one responsible for the deforestation in the Amazon. And now she looked at me and she was so happy. You know when someone looks at you and they're so smug and so pleased with themselves? Oh, that look, right? She gave me that look and it really got under my skin. So I went home that day and I Googled, is soy farming bad for the Amazon rainforest? Lo and behold, soy farming is devastating for the Amazon rainforest. It's one of the leading contributors of Amazon deforestation, and of course all these wildfires that we've been hearing about with increasing severity, especially this year. I thought, is this true though? And so I did a little bit more research, kept digging deeper, and it turns out that the main consensus is that around 75 to 80% of the soy that's produced is fed to livestock animals. And actually, that soy production is the soy production in the Amazon, the GMO soy. But actually, the soy that's produced for vegan products is mostly non-GMO for starters, but it's also produced in other places. So for us, living in Europe, a lot of it's produced in France. Companies like Alpro are based in France. And of course, if you live in North America, they produce a lot of soy in the US. And I thought, if only I'd known this. I could have said that to Rihanna, and I'd have used her logic against her, and then she'd have had to have gone vegan, right? Because I had shown why it was bad, and that was in contradiction for her values, right? No. It would have been too wishful, no doubt, to think that she'd have changed, but at least I'd had something to say to her. And so I carried on doing some research. And what's really upsetting about the soy thing is when we talk about the environment and animal products, we often talk about red meat, don't we? Cattle, sheep, and the problem that they have on the environment. And we'll, of course, talk about that this evening. But the thing about soy is in Europe, we import soy from South America. Now, in the UK, we import somewhere between 1.83 million and 2.5 million tons of soy every single year from South America to just feed the animals in the UK alone, our livestock animals. Now, the conservative estimate of 1.83 is equal to 900,000 hectares of South American rainforest destroyed just for the soy for the animals in the UK alone. And our soy is imported in Switzerland, it's imported across, well, into most European countries, if not all of them. But actually, with the importation of soy, just over 50% of it's fed to poultry, so chickens, for their meat and also for their eggs. And so when we look at soy farming in the Amazon, the biggest ones responsible or the biggest contributor to that is actually chickens, for those free-range eggs or caged eggs or that chicken meat that we consume, which is kind of shocking because we don't think about it that much. We think that chicken meat's often the sustainable form of meat consumption. But actually, when we look at the Amazon and our personal responsibility on the Amazon, it's that chicken meat and even those eggs, because poultry feed is filled with soy. Now, another problem with deforestation is obviously that it emits CO2 back into the atmosphere. Of course, trees, through the process of photosynthesis, absorb carbon. When we destroy the trees, that carbon gets re-released. Now, the most kind of like generally accepted equation is that 1 hectare of deforested rainforest equals about 3.67 tons of CO2 equivalent, which means that the deforestation from the Amazon just for soy in the UK is equal to around about 3.5 million tons of CO2 equivalent being put back into our atmosphere, which is kind of shocking when we think about that. Now, in the UK, often what's cited is that the UK is only responsible, or animal agriculture in the UK is only responsible for about 10% of emissions, but they don't count the emissions that take place abroad. Kind of a bit cheeky, isn't it? Okay, let's move the conversation on. Now, one of the big problems that we face with climate change in the future is obviously to do with droughts, lack of water availability, and of course, food scarcity as a consequence of these problems. We're talking by 2050, we'll have more people on this planet, maybe somewhere between 9 and 10 billion, depending where you look, but also we'll have less resources available for us. Now, people are living in areas where they can't produce food or there's not enough water, or say that due to extreme weather patterns, they can no longer live there, will be forced to migrate. And so we're talking about in the future having tens of millions, maybe even hundreds of millions of climate refugees, people who are displaced from their homes for one reason or another, who are forced to move to somewhere with fertile land, with habitable areas where they can live. And for many people, they'll be looking north to Europe, and of course to North America as well. And that poses a big ethical dilemma for us, because looking forward, there'll be more of people living in Europe and North America as well, but we'll have more finite resources to begin with as well. And so as we look towards the future, one of the most important things we'll face is the notion of efficiency with our resources, how to be efficient with water and with food, but also with land as well. Because land is a really important factor in agriculture that's often not discussed nearly as much as it should be. And so there was a study released last year, championed by the University of Oxford. It's called Reducing Food's Impact on the Environment Through Producers and Consumers. It's a 5-year study. It looked at 40,000 farms in 119 countries all around the world. And it assessed the 40 major food items that make up about 90% of our global diet. It was published in a journal called Science, which is one of the most highly regarded scientific journals in the world. And it looked at a few different issues related to food and farming. It's important to note it looked at all different systems of farming. So factory farming, the grass-fed sector, and also plant-based agriculture as well. And the number one thing it looked at was land usage. It said that globally, 83% of agricultural land is given to animal agriculture. 83%, which seems like a startling figure, doesn't it? But according to data from the European Commission, 63% of all arable land across Europe is given to producing feed for animals. 63%. And according to a report from the United Nations, 26% of terrestrial surface is given to grazing animals. And so we can see how quickly the amount of land given to these animals stacks up exponentially. 83%. Now, the biggest problem isn't really just the land usage, but the output of resources that we get as a consequence of that land usage. But this 5-year study, which, by the way, is considered the most comprehensive analysis ever conducted exploring the relationship between farming and the environment, said that actually, globally, animal products only give us around 37% of our protein intake and as little as 18% of our global calorie intake. And so we're giving so much land to products that really don't provide us that much in return, which is startling, incredibly inefficient when we think about it. Now, it's said that if we switch to a plant-based diet, we could free up the amount of agricultural land that we use by 75% and still feed everyone on this planet. We could reduce it by 3/4, but still have enough land to produce food to feed everyone. Now, let's bear in mind that animals consume food, don't they? Of course they do. And we kill 75 billion land animals every single year. And so those 75 billion land animals need to be fed something. We also farm fish, and farmed fish are often also fed cropland foods as well. But let's take the fish out and just say 75 billion land animals. Now, according to a department in the USDA, it takes about 16 kilograms of plants to produce 1 kilogram of cow flesh, beef. 16-to-1, that ratio. A study called Eating Away at Climate Emissions from Harvard Law School says it takes 37 calories of plants to produce 1 calorie of beef. And the lowest one is eggs and dairy. But they still take 6 calories of plants to produce 1 calorie of eggs or dairy, which means we're putting so much in for something that we don't get that much in return of. And so let's say we reclaim this agricultural land from animal agriculture. What can we do with that land? Well, of course, there's a couple of things that we can do that would be much more efficient than what we currently do. The first thing we could do is we could start to produce more human edible crops. Remember, in the future, our population will have increased, but the amount of fertile land through things like desertification and topsoil erosion will have decreased as well. And so we have to be more efficient with that land. So one thing we could do is repurpose that land to produce human edible crops. So this Harvard Law School study called Eating Away at Climate Emissions said that if you took the croplands in the US, so this is the land just in the US that we use to grow crops to feed to livestock in the US, you could use that land and start producing human edible crops on that land and feed another 320 million people just by using the land in the US alone that's grown to feed animals in the US alone. 320 million people is about the size of the US population. So you could feed another US, technically, with just the land used to feed animals there. It said in the UK, where I live, of course, if you took 1/3, so 33% of the land that we use to grow crops to feed animals in the UK, you could produce enough fruits and vegetables to feed every single person in the UK their 5 recommended portions of fruit and vegetable every day, all year round, just with 1/3 of that land. And that, to me, seems like something we're going to have to really start talking about in the future, when we have less food to give out, less water to use, but more people. Now, I think this is a human rights problem as well, because climate change is a social justice issue. What I mean by that is it's affecting those who have done least to cause it the most severely, and it will even more so as we look into the future. When we talk about climate refugees, we're not talking about each other in this room. We're talking about those people in the world who are already living in impoverishment, who have done least to cause the problem, but they are the ones who are going to be most persecuted as a consequence of the problem that they've not even really caused. Which means that how we act today is a human rights issue into the future. And so how we choose to consume will impact the lives of others, not just our children and grandchildren, but other people in the world as well. And so we have to start thinking more proactively about the responsibility that we have as individuals, not just as a collective, and not just what we're asking those in positions of power to achieve either. Now, another thing we could do with this land is we could rewild it. Now, I think rewilding is one of the most exciting prospects for the future. It is basically as it sounds. We take the land and we try to return it to its more natural habitat. Of course, natural is used somewhat loosely, but we try to encourage a more natural, harmonious ecosystem instead of what we have currently. Because the thing is, when we clear land for agriculture, we do exactly that. We clear land. A majority of the land that we use for agriculture, forestlands, woodlands, rainforests, savanna, grasslands, And all of these natural habitats play a fundamental role in the ecology of the world. And we've destroyed so much of them, of course, for cities and for roads, but for agriculture mainly, 83% of which is for animals. So we could rewild that land. Now, rewilding would do a couple of wonderful things. Firstly, we've taken away a massive part of the problem. Now, according to the FAO, the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, in their study, The Livestock's Long Shadow, animals produce about 14.5% of total greenhouse gas emissions, or animal agriculture does. Now, 14.5 maybe doesn't sound that much, but that actually makes it the second biggest polluter of emissions as an industry, and means that it pollutes more greenhouse gases than the entire transportation system combined. More than all the planes, all the cars, all the motorbikes, all the boats, it's the animals and the production of animals. So 14.5% all of a sudden becomes a really scary figure. And that's a conservative estimate, according to some scientists think it's more than that, but 14.5 is enough for it to be a significant problem that needs addressing. And so a switch to a plant-based food system eradicates part of that problem. But not only that, but we can replace it with one of the biggest solutions that we have. Now, I'm sure we've all heard or read about or had conversations where we say, if only we could just build these big machines, right, that just suck all the carbon from the atmosphere and then, neutralize it and turn it into something, like oxygen or something, right? Oh, if only scientists could come together and brainstorm how we could build these big machines. Forgetting, of course, that we've had these machines, well, they've been around since longer than we have. They're called trees. And so if we can get more trees, we can take carbon from our atmosphere. Rewilding is one of the best defenses we have against carbon in our atmosphere. So take away part of the problem and replace it with one of the solutions. Trees, healthy soils, forestlands, woodlands, rainforests, grasslands. And the thing is, you can do something called trophic rewilding as well. And trophic rewilding is about reintroducing animals back into the ecology. Because the thing is, we've hunted many indigenous animals to the point of extinction or into extinction, often to protect the interests of animal farmers, because many of these animals would kill the animals they farm, but also because we've taken away so many of their habitats. Now, indigenous animals often play a fundamental role in the harmony of the ecosystems where they're found. But we've taken away indigenous animals, and instead we've replaced them with selectively bred, artificially inseminated, and genetically modified animals, who, of course, are doing terrible things to our environment, causing desertification and land erosion, and all these big fundamental problems. Take them out of the equation. Trophically rewild indigenous animals, both herbivorous and carnivorous, to re-stabilize those food chains. Now, in America, the bison, of course, were hunted, and their numbers were decimated. But as we look towards the future, trophically rewilding bison back into their natural habitats is a really important thing we can do, because these animals are adapted to the landscapes where they used to survive. So let's take bison. Their hooves, when they walk, they cut through the grass, which encourages sequestration back into the soil again. And so these animals play a fundamental role in the ecology. Let's reclaim that land. Let's return it to its more harmonious setting as much as we possibly can. Now, this 5-year study from the University of Oxford, the most comprehensive analysis ever conducted, it concluded by saying the single biggest thing that we can do as individuals to mitigate or alleviate our personal impact on the environment is to adopt a vegan lifestyle. The single biggest. Because the thing is, if we stop flying, and of course we should look to reduce flying as much as we can, we deal with a couple aspects of the problem. But what we do with animals hits so many different aspects. Of course, you've got the emissions. You've also got the land usage. You've also got the crop usage. You've also got the water usage. You've also got the ethical impact of what we do to animals as well. And by removing that, you open up a whole world of possibilities for positive changes that we can implement as a consequence as well. Now, another thing is to do with plastic. We talk about climate change, we talk about single-use plastic, and of course we absolutely should. There's a piece of research produced by Greenpeace only a matter of weeks ago that looked at something called ghost nets in the ocean. Now, ghost nets, or ghost gear, is basically discarded fishing gear that's dumped into the ocean from the fishing industry. This piece of research said the number one contributor of macroplastic into the ocean, so macroplastic is plastic that's bigger than 20 centimeters, the number one contributor is the fishing industry, because of huge nets that are dumped, or fishing equipment that's just dumped into the water, or maybe breaks during the fishing process. Now think about these huge trawler nets that we have that just take up all of the life in the ocean. They run for kilometers, just dragging up all the animals we eat, all the animals we don't as well, just annihilating the ocean landscape. When these nets are dropped or break or thrown into the water, they still continue doing what they always have done, which is catching life and, of course, killing life as well. It causes huge problems to the ecosystems within our ocean. Though it's ironic, isn't it? Because companies like McDonald's will ban the plastic straw because they want to care about fish in the ocean, and we think that's a great thing, but on their menu they have a fish burger. And that fish burger will contribute to more environmental degradation in the ocean than plastic straws ever could. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't stop using plastic straws, but it's an ironic point that we vilify small parts of the problem without looking at the bigger picture. It's like we can't see the wood through the trees. We get hung up on isolated points rather than looking at the bigger issue at hand. And the thing about veganism is it intersects with so many of these important environmental issues. And it's something we also have complete control over. I think often what happens with climate change in the environment is we become a little bit disillusioned because we look at the problems and we feel helpless to bring about that change. We think there's powerful political special interest groups and lobby groups who are more financially powerful and influential than we'll ever be. How do we go up against these companies and these corporations, these industries, and these corrupt politicians that take handouts from these industries? We think, what can we actually do other than striking and protesting? But what we choose to eat every single day is our decision to make. Our decision to make. And so we have autonomy to make the decision that best aligns with how we feel. It just so happens that decision could be one of the most impactful things that we can do. In fact, as individuals, is the most impactful thing we can do to protect our environment. Now, I do want to move the conversation on. There's so much to talk about, and there's so many things that we could be here for hours, but I don't want to keep you for more than just a few hours that we've got allocated. Although I can talk, so I apologize for that, right? And I want to talk a little bit more about the other side of veganism, the ethical, philosophical aspect of veganism, because the environmental benefits are really just a benefit. They're not the reason in and of itself to necessarily think differently about our food choices. They're a positive benefit that comes as a consequence of thinking more in depth about the moral issues of what we do to others. Now remember, I looked at Rupert the hamster. And that was the connection I made in that moment. Now last year, the Winter Olympics took place in South Korea. And just before the Winter Olympics took place, something very interesting happened. Some of the British press, the newspapers, said that the athletes should boycott going and competing in South Korea. And I thought to myself, my goodness, boycott? Well, what's happened in South Korea that's so bad? I mean, these athletes have trained their entire life for this moment. This could be their proudest achievement. They could win a gold medal for their country. And we're asking them to not go. Well, what could have possibly happened? Turns out in South Korea, well, you know, where we live, we eat chickens, don't we? And cows, of course, and pigs, and lambs, and foie gras, and veal, and salmon, and tuna, and goat, and geese, and ducks, and mackerel, and swordfish, and monkfish. Well, in South Korea, they eat 2 more animals than the animals we eat. They eat dogs and cats, right? And so we're saying that these athletes shouldn't go and compete because they eat dogs and cats, but we eat all these other animals. I thought that seems strange, doesn't it? Slightly hypocritical, perhaps. Some of the athletes went. They went to a dog meat farm and rescued some dogs. Now, I thought that was an amazing thing to do, and I wasn't the only one. The British press called them animal rights activists. Fancy that, right? Animal heroes. Heroes for animals. But they went back to where they were staying and ate chickens and cows and pigs and dairy and eggs and all the other animal products that we eat. It just didn't seem to make sense to me. I thought that was a bit jarring. Now, we do have a special relationship with dogs. There's nothing wrong with that. Dogs are amazing animals, as I'm sure we all acknowledge. There's a film called I Am Legend, right? I don't know if anyone's ever seen it. It's got Will Smith in it, right? Will Smith is the last man on Earth, right? Only vampires around him. And he also has his dog, right? And I remember watching this film in the cinema. I think I was about 13, so you'll have to bear with me for my reaction. I was about 13 years old. And I was watching the film, and I remember thinking to myself, I like Will Smith. I think Will Smith is a good guy. He seems nice, right? But if he dies in this film, I couldn't care less. I remember thinking, it's an okay film. If Will Smith dies, I'm okay with that. I said to myself, but they better not kill his dog. Why would they want to kill his dog? Spoiler alert, they do kill his dog in the film, right? Okay. And I remember being in the cinema, and I started having a little cry, thinking, how could they do this? What barbarians are these filmmakers? Who wrote this script? How could they? Not the dog. Kill Will Smith, right? Let him go. I don't mind the guy, but I don't care if he lives or dies. Save the dog, let the dog be free. No, they wouldn't do that. Because we have a special attachment to dogs. They're amazing. But at the same time, what is the difference? Really, what is the difference? Why do we love some animals and then kill some animals? More than that, why do we give some animals a name? Maybe it's Boxer the dog or Fluffy the cat. Why do we love them in our homes? Why do we treat them as individuals, as family members? Why do we grieve when they die? And then why for other animals do we give them an ear tag with a number? A numerical value as a form of identity that takes away their right to be viewed as individuals, that denies them the right to be acknowledged as a someone. And instead, we call them commodities, don't we? Objects, livestock. Now, the interesting thing about livestock is stock that is what you find on a supermarket shelf. The shelves are filled with stock. We refer to sentient life as supermarket stock. We take away their autonomy, their right to their body. We mutilate them, forcibly impregnate them, take their babies away from them, and then we take their life from them when we want to. But what is the difference? Why is that acceptable for some and not for others? Why do we have this paradoxical view of how animals should be allowed to live or shouldn't be allowed to live, as the case may be? I mean, if we boil it down, we recognize, don't we, that as humans, we're different in a multitude of different ways. And those differences are wonderful. They make us unique. They define us as individuals. They're beautiful. They're amazing. But it's not our differences that are important. It's what we share in common that's important. Now, we acknowledge that animals are, of course, widely different to us. Some swim, some fly, some run, some have hoofs, some have scales, some have feathers, some bark, some woof, some oink, some mew, some moo, some meow, right? They do a whole range of different things that make them different. But why do we use their differences as a reason to harm them? It's not their differences that are important, but what they share in common. And what they share in common is, of course, they're alive, of course, but they're also sentient and conscious, as defined by the Declaration of Consciousness from the University of Cambridge. They can all feel, so both positive and negative, pain, happiness, suffering, joy. They can also have individualistic experiences of life. Now, of course, our life is unique to us, isn't it? No one else will ever live the life that we live. No one else will ever have the experiences that we have in the ways that we have them. Our life is intrinsically unique, but so are theirs. No other animal will live the life that they live, have the experiences that they have through the worldview that they have and the ways that they have them. They are unique in that sense as well. And so why do we think it's acceptable to do what we do to them? What justification can we find to exploit them in the ways that we do? Now, for food, it's quite obvious. One of the main reasons is we say taste, don't we? We like how they taste. People often say to me, you're vegan. You've obviously never had bacon, right? And halloumi. And you've never had steak, a medium rare steak. Because if you did, you would never want to be vegan because they taste so good. And that's interesting, isn't it? Now, I've never met a vegan to this day who went vegan because they stopped enjoying the taste of these products. I don't even think that vegan exists, right? If you find a vegan who tells you they didn't like fried chicken or pizza or steak or salmon sushi or any of these things, I'd be a little bit concerned about them, actually, because it's not normal. That's not the normal stance. We do like how these things taste. But that's not why we stop eating them, of course. Let's say we create some sort of scale, don't we? And so on one side of the scale, we place the reason, the justification. And on the other side of the scale, we place the consequence. So we have the reason and the consequence. Now, the reason's taste, isn't it? The consequence is obviously life, because to enjoy the taste, life is taken. Even for dairy and eggs, all these animals are killed in slaughterhouses. And so even for that physical product of cheese and egg, they might not have been killed for it, but they will be killed. All dairy cows and egg-laying hens are killed in the exact same slaughterhouses as the animals we raise solely for meat. And so we create this scale, and we say, well, what has higher value? Taste or life? Taste or life? Our taste buds or their life? Now, to me, it was life. That's why I made that choice. But some people will say taste to me. They say, well, actually, I think my taste buds are more important. And the actual argument we're making then is an appeal to sensory pleasure. Taste is a sense. I enjoy how it tastes. It provides my sense with pleasure. So the justification is that sensory pleasure morally justifies an action. Do we actually think that? Let's think of different scenarios. Let me say, can we think of environments or experiences, things that happen where someone feels sensory pleasure at the expense of someone else? We can think of many, can't we? And then we say, is that action justified because someone feels sensory pleasure? And we say, well, of course not. What difference does that make? It doesn't matter if someone enjoys it. What about the victim? If there's a victim who suffers, that is what is important. Of course. So why is it when animals are the victims and we're the oppressors, the sensory pleasure does justify what we do? That's an inconsistency, surely. We don't actually subscribe to that way of thinking, and so taste doesn't justify what we do to others as much as we'd like it to. It has no bearing on whether or not they should be killed for us. It's superfluous in the conversation. Now, of course, often people say to me that they don't mind vegans, that they actually quite like vegans, but they only like vegans because they respect their personal choice. And so vegans in return should respect their personal choice as well. And of course, vegans have a reputation, don't they, for forcing views. Now, I get that a lot. Stop forcing your views on me, people say. And that's interesting, isn't it? Of course, what we choose to buy is a personal choice. Choice is very important. And of course, when we leave here today, what we want to eat afterwards will be entirely on us. Well, actually, it's all vegan here, so maybe not tonight. But when we leave and then we go into our lives again, what we choose to buy will entirely be on us. And so we have that choice, don't we? We can go into a co-op, we can buy steak, we can buy chicken, we can buy lamb, we can buy tofu, we can buy black beans, we can buy brown rice, we can buy a vegan meat substitute, we can buy a whole range of different foods. Fantastic. But the question is, should a choice be automatically justified simply because it's a personal choice? I mean, every action we make is a personal choice, right? Whether or not that action is right or wrong, moral or immoral. For example, Switzerland is very expensive. I've come to realize that quite quickly. I'm from London even, I'm a bit shocked, right? So when I leave, I might be thinking to myself, oh, I'm a bit low on francs, so I could do with a few more. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mug someone. I'm going to take their wallet off them, right? That's a personal choice, isn't it? Of course, it's not moral. Now, I'm being a little bit facetious. I appreciate that. Because, of course, mugging someone is illegal. It's criminal. But buying a steak from Co-op is perfectly legal. So what's the problem then? Well, then the question is, does legality equal morality? Should something be considered moral just because the law says so? That's dangerous, isn't it? Because we can look throughout our past, see many instances where things were legally allowed, but were certainly not moral. And if we believe that legality equals morality, that means that the individual legal systems of every country dictates what is moral. And that is certainly not true, right? We can look across the world and see many legal things that morally are absolutely grotesque. And so we don't believe that legality equals morality. And so it's not a personal choice, or it is, but that doesn't determine the morality of it. And neither does the legal system either. And now forcing views is very interesting, isn't it? I can't follow you all home. I can't make you buy tofu. By the way, I wouldn't want to, okay? Just to make that clear, I'm not that creepy. But I couldn't, even if I did. I couldn't make you buy tofu. I couldn't make you cook it. I couldn't make you eat it. And then I couldn't tell you, I told you it's not that bad, right? I told you. Because what we have is autonomy over our own choices. I can't force anything. A vegan can't force you to be a certain way. We can be loud, probably a little bit militant, if you want to use that word. But we can't force you. But when we buy a product, let's say a piece of steak from a supermarket, we take that steak, we're demanding that steak be replaced. And so when we demand the steak is replaced, what that means is we're forcing someone else to die. Now, what could be more forceful than someone's life being taken against their will for our beliefs? The belief that I want to eat meat or dairy or eggs. What could be more forceful than that? Then sometimes people say to me, they say, Ed, I will go vegan the day that you stare a lion in the eye and you convince a lion to be vegan, right? Because lions are animals and humans are animals, and so if lions can eat other animals, then I can eat other animals as well, right? You have no idea how many people think they're lions. It's quite disturbing, actually. Like, it's a bit worrying. I had no idea we were able to morph into different species. Anyway, but this is true apparently now. But that's interesting, isn't it? Of course, animals do eat other animals. There's no denying that. A lion kills a gazelle and eats them. But lions do it because they have to survive, don't they? They're obligate carnivores. We don't have to. And of course, lions as well do a whole host of other things that we would never consider acceptable within a human-centric society. One of those things being murder. Lions kill other lions. Now imagine if a human killed another human and they went to court and the judge said, "What is your defense?" And you say, well, to be fair, Judge, lions kill other lions, right? And lions are animals. And if I'm an animal and lions can do it, then of course. And the judge is like, case dismissed. Off you go, be a free man. No. It's illogical, isn't it? But why would we base our morality on the actions of animals, or indeed our ancestors? Sometimes people say to me, they say, Ed, you're awfully ungrateful. I think, what have I done now? And they say, well, because your ancestors used to eat meat. And if your ancestors hadn't eaten meat, then you wouldn't be alive today. Are you going to stare your ancestors in the eyes and tell them that they did something wrong? Well, of course not. Just because we've done something for a long period of time doesn't justify its continuation in a modern society. Our ancestors did what they had to do to survive. Now, there's a plane crash in the 1970s in the Andes. The survivors of the plane crash survived because they cannibalized on dead passengers. Now, cannibalism became a morally justifiable act in that moment. But cannibalism isn't a justifiable act in everyday society, of course not. I think something similar about animals, non-human animals, that is, in a sense of, if we had to, you could find justifications. But in the absence of a requirement, we don't need to, justifications become harder to come by, especially when there is an abundance of alternatives and options. I mean, on campus already, without these wonderful changes that are being requested, there's vegan options. And so it is possible for us. Not only that, but it's relatively easy as well. Now, of course, there's no denying that as humans, we are intellectually and physically dominant. I can't deny that. What we can achieve is unbelievable. The things we've done as a species are incomparable, fantastic. But does intelligence define worth of life? I mean, we don't actually live by that philosophy, do we? Because we don't treat each other differently based on intellectual capacity. That would be, of course, incredibly immoral. But even when we look at non-human animals, we don't create a ranking system of intelligence. For instance, pigs have been shown to be more intelligent than dogs. And yet, as we've established, we love dogs, but farm pigs by the billions, gas them in gas chambers, and eat them. And so we don't actually believe that intelligence defines worth of life. And even if we did, we'd still be vegan, because, of course, plants are the least intelligent form of life when compared to animals. So even if we took that principle in its fullest extent, we'd still be vegan anyway. But we don't think that. And of course, we don't believe that physical dominance or physicality determines how we should treat others. That's a might makes right type of philosophy, which is, of course, very immoral. And so if we don't believe that physicality or intellect determines what we should do, then how do we justify it from here? Now, I believe, of course, that with knowledge comes responsibility. And so actually, because we're so intellectual, and because we can achieve so much, if anything, that determines even more why what we do to animals should be scrutinized, challenged, and questioned. Because actually, when we look at it logically, it becomes very hard to rationalize what we do to others, especially the extent of which we do it. And so actually, if we applied the intellectual capacity that we often boast that we have, and we applied it to its fullest extent, veganism all of a sudden starts to make even more sense. Now, I think when you have that intellectual and physicality, you have two options, don't you? Now, the first option is you can use those attributes and those traits to have some form of authoritarian rule over others. Now, I don't think we can deny for a second that that's what we've chosen so far. We breed these animals into existence. We mutilate them. We exploit them for what they produce for their own species. We take their babies away. We keep them in cages. And ultimately, we kill them anyway. We take their life from them. It couldn't be more authoritarian than it actually is right now. But we have another option, don't we? Which is to actually act more as stewards. When we look inside a human-centric society, we see those who are most vulnerable as deserving the most protection. When we take non-human animals into that equation, we use their vulnerabilities as a reason to exploit them. But surely their vulnerabilities and weaknesses are more reason for us to try and protect them. Now, I don't think we have to go out of our way. Being stewards, and don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to paint some naive picture of the future. I'm not talking about a world where we're skipping down country lanes and there's the cows and the pigs and we're all cuddling in these rewilded forest lands, right? I know that that's naive and farcical. I'm just saying that we shouldn't harm them. Being vegan is a passive action. It requires nothing from us. It actually requires the absence of an action, because to not be vegan is to actively impose some form of exploitation on someone else. It's an active action. Being vegan is a passive thing, so to be stewards means just to leave them alone, to acknowledge the right to their own autonomy in life, to not breed them into these systems. And I think that's what we should be doing with the moral agency, the intellectual capacity, and of course the physical dominance that we have. It becomes tricky, doesn't it? the longer and further we go. And so I'm going to finish in a couple of minutes because I think that's important. So we have time for questions and we can scrutinize some of these ideas and maybe get into more details about some of these aspects. Now, often we like to use labels, don't we, to justify what we do. One of the labels that we often use with animals is the notion of humane slaughter. I'm sure we've all heard this. People sometimes say, Ed, we're on the same page. I also think halal and kosher slaughter is barbaric, right? The way they just cut the animals' throats without stunning them. I agree with you, which is why I only ever buy meat, dairy, and eggs that come from animals who are going to be killed humanely. But what does that word humane mean? Now, when we apply a word like humane next to an action like slaughter, we have to define what the word humane means, don't we? So let's open up an imaginary thesaurus. Let's find the word humane. What other words do we find there? We find benevolence, we find compassion, we find kindness. And so for slaughter to be humane, slaughter must also be compassionate, it must also be benevolent, it must also be kind. But can we compassionately take the life of an animal who doesn't want to die and who doesn't have to die? I say who doesn't want to die, and what I mean by that is animals don't willfully walk onto the kill floor of a slaughterhouse. They don't willfully present their neck to the slaughterman and say, please, of course, as you would like to. They're forced there against their will. And for any who try to escape, well, there's no mercy shown to them. We sometimes hear stories, don't we, of animals who have escaped slaughterhouses. We hear about them in the news. And we root for the animals. How crazy is that? We actually root for the animals when they escape. Happens in the US a lot, happened in the UK in a place called Carlisle not too long ago. And the news were rooting for them. People were saying, give the animal life, they've deserved it, they've earned it, they escaped. But you're eating an animal who's the same who was killed and they should be killed because they didn't escape? Animals don't willfully walk onto the kill floor of a slaughterhouse. They're not willing participants in their own exploitation. They're coerced and they're forced to comply, especially with violence, if they don't partake in it willfully. So that's what I mean. And so how can that be compassionate or humane? It can't be. Now, the humane method of killing pigs across Europe is in the gas chamber. 2 or 3 pigs are loaded into a metal cage that's dropped into an abyss that's filled with an aversive mixture of carbon dioxide. The CO2 forces them to suffocate. It takes about half a minute sometimes, and it also burns the moisture behind their eyes and in their throats, causing them significant amounts of pain. We call this humane because they get to die together. Oh, wow. Are these industries so kind? They're so kind. Because normally pigs are individually stunned, individually hung up, and then individually killed by having their throats cut. But this way, they get to die together. And we call that compassionate. We call that high welfare. We call that humane. In the European Union right now, there's a debate taking place in Brussels about whether or not vegan burgers should legally be allowed to be called burgers. Also, should oat milk be legally allowed to be called milk? Interesting, isn't it? In some places, already illegal to call oat milk milk because they say it's misleading to consumers, right? This is how arrogant these people are. They think that we as consumers are not very bright. And so we walk into a supermarket and we see oat milk and we go, oat? Milk? Right? Oat? And then we see the word milk, and so it's got milk on it, but therefore it must be cow's milk, because why else would it say milk, right? Just forget the oat bit, right? And so we buy it, we take it home, we pour it on our cereal, we have a bite, and we go, this isn't milk, right? Or the pesky vegans at it again. If only someone could come and save us with some piece of legislation, right, that would make everything better again, because that's definitely what we need more of, right? Isn't that ironic? They think we're so unintelligent that we can't differentiate between products that we're buying, and so they need to protect us because it's confusing to consumers. It's interesting, isn't it? Oat milk shouldn't be called milk, but we can call slaughter humane. Interesting. Also, what about dairy? In the UK, there's a supermarket called Tesco. I actually really like Tesco. They've got a lot of good vegan options. But down their dairy aisles, they have 2 things. First thing is 100% British. It always says 100% British. And the second thing is happy cows produce happy milk. Now, the 100% British thing is very interesting, isn't it? Because we think, well, it's made in Britain. Therefore, it's great. I'm sure that happened, but I know for a fact it happens in Switzerland, doesn't it? It's like 100% Swiss. Well, then we know it's good, right? Because if it said like 50% Swiss, 50% American, we'd start to get a bit worried, wouldn't we? Right? Because what we all know, right, is that what happens in America or China or Russia, that's terrible. We can, vegan, non-vegan alike, we all share that, don't we? Fears of what happens to animals in other countries. But we also know that in our country, it's the best in the world, right? And that's actually interesting. In the UK, where I live, we're rated A for animal welfare. Guess who else is? Switzerland. Right? So that means that the UK, Switzerland, New Zealand, and Austria are officially the 4 best countries in the world for how we treat animals. Nobody does it better than we do, guys, so well done for that, right? Nobody exploits animals like we do, right? But it's interesting because that must mean something, right? And so when we see labels like 100% British, that means that we're reassured that the animals are treated well, right? Happy cows produce happy milk. Now, these standards, I'm going to go through them very, very quickly just so you get an idea of the absurdity of what it is I'm referencing. These standards, what happens in the UK, are the same as what happens here in Switzerland. And as we've established, that's an A-rated welfare scheme, meaning that it is technically the best in the world. But this is what the best of the best sounds like. It becomes quite worrying quite quickly. Cows produce milk because they're mammals, meaning they only produce milk to feed their children. Like humans, of course. This means that farmers will forcibly impregnate dairy cows every single year to ensure continuous lactation and, of course, more calves to introduce into the herd so they can keep making money. Now, of course, that first involves semen, doesn't it? Impregnation involves semen. And so they have to take semen from a bull. And so you can think about the ways that that might happen, and yes, that is exactly how it does happen. It's very weird, isn't it, to think about that? So they get the semen from a bull, they take the semen to a dairy farm, and they restrain the dairy cow. The restrainers sometimes in these big metal cages because these cages can be used for antibiotics. They can be used for kind of like bovine TB checks, so checking for diseases and illnesses. It's also used in impregnations as well. So the cow will be restrained. The farmer will then place his arm inside the anus of the dairy cow. He'll hold her cervix in place through the lining of the anus. He'll take the bull semen and inject the bull semen inside of her vagina and into her cervix. Now, the cow will be pregnant for about 9 months. Her gestation is very similar to that of a human's gestation. When she gives birth, the calf only needs the first feed from their mother. The first feed has something called colostrum in it. Now, colostrum is full of antibodies. The antibodies are essential to the calf's survival. But once the calf has had the first feed, they're no longer seen as useful, well, to the industry. Because the more milk they consume, the less milk the farmer can sell. And so the farmer will separate the calf away from their mother, normally within the first 24 hours. The females will be put in solitary confinement hutches. These are hutches that are maybe 2.5 meters long, potentially 1.5 to 2 meters wide. They can legally spend the first 8 weeks of their life in these hutches. First 8 weeks of their life, no exercise, of course, but no companionship, no playing. Calves are actually like big dogs. They like to run and jump and play, and they're very curious animals. And we put them in these hutches. Take them away from their mothers. Now, males are, of course, useless to the dairy industry. They won't produce milk. They also won't grow to be the same size as the cattle that we rear for beef. And so some may be sold into the beef herd, but often that's not seen as a profitable venture for farmers. And so one of 2 things is more common to happen. In Switzerland, they're often killed for veal, baby cow, calf meat, of course. I've seen that a lot while I've been here, which is actually shocking for me because we don't eat veal in the UK. Like, people do not eat veal. It's actually quite a big thing that people are staunchly against. But here, of course, a lot of people eat veal. It's very cultural, isn't it? So a lot of the time, that means the calves are killed for veal, or in the UK where I'm from, they're shot. So 90,000 male dairy calves are shot every single year in the UK just because they won't produce milk and because, kind of contradictorily, I suppose, people don't want to eat their flesh because it's seen as wrong to eat a baby, even though most of the animals we eat are babies anyway. So there's an interesting thing happening there. Happy cows produce happy milk. Still thinking on that one, right? Now, the mothers will be exploited for their milk about 2 or 3 times a day, and then they'll be taken to a slaughterhouse after about 4 to 6 years of life. Bolt gun against their head and a knife across their throat. Happy cows produce happy milk. At what point does that sound like happiness? At what point does that sound good? Yes, of course, we see dairy cows grazing, don't we? And we think they must be living a wonderful life. But we don't see the insidious reality of what's happening when they're not grazing, what's happening on a daily basis. Now, of course, remember that dairy cows don't willfully often walk to be milked. This is a big problem. And so farmers will message me saying things like, it's not abusive for us to hit the animals, because if they don't walk to be milked, what are we supposed to do? You have no idea how many times I get told that by farmers. We released an expose in the UK that looked at 8 different dairy farms. And on every dairy farm that we investigated, we saw animals being hit, punched, kicked, sworn at, beaten. And I had dairy farmers messaging me saying it's okay for us to hit these animals because they don't do what we ask them to do if we speak in English to them. It's ridiculous, isn't it? Scary. Anyway, I just want to show to you that's what A-rated welfare sounds like. When we talk about Swiss standards or UK standards, it doesn't mean there's no exploitation occurring. It doesn't mean that what happens doesn't cause these animals suffering, because the suffering is both illegal, but it's also legal as well. So let me finish here. When we consume a meal, that meal lasts, maybe 15 minutes, potentially 20 minutes if we're eating slowly. Let's say we have lunch, could be done in 10 minutes if we're eating and then getting on with our day. We eat a meal, and it's done. I could say to you, what did you have for lunch 8 days ago? Probably not much of an idea. What did you have for dinner 15 days ago? Even less of an idea. Because we eat, often unconsciously, and then we move on with our lives almost immediately afterwards. But that meal, 8 days ago, 12 days ago, 15 days ago, this lunchtime, could have cost someone their life or contributed to a system where they're being exploited and their life will be taken from them. We take everything from them, their entire existence, their autonomy, their freedom, their right to their own body, and we take it from them for something we eat in 15 minutes and then move on with our day afterwards. An inconsequential amount of time has cost them everything. For what? Something we consume, forget, and move on with. And so I think it's time for us to start thinking more detailed about our actions, to start to scrutinize how we live, because through scrutiny, we actually realize how we actually feel about different environments, whether that's climate change, whether that's the morals of what we do to animals, the ethical implications. We should challenge every ideology, every belief system, every value system, every religion, every philosophy. Everything should be challenged and scrutinized, especially those that are so ingrained they're considered culturally normal. Because often it's those cultural norms that can lead to some of the worst forms of oppression. And so everything should be challenged, especially those ideas that are ingrained beyond what we feel should be challenged. And so I hope tonight maybe we can challenge these ideas further. I hope you've enjoyed listening to me. I told you I can talk, and I apologize for that. But I hope you've found it insightful, engaging, and I'm very grateful that you're all here. So thank you so much for listening.